Hello guys. If you like our content and you love scary stories, then subscribe, like, and write in the comments your scary stories so that we write your story. Scary viewing and terrifying sensations to you. Whispers in the Dark, The Haunting of Blackwood Manor, Part 1. The Arrival. Blackwood Manor had always been a place of whispered legends, a grand old house nestled deep within the forest, far from the nearest town. For years, it had stood empty, its windows like darkened eyes watching over the landscape. The locals spoke of it in hushed tones, warning travelers to stay away. Some said the house was cursed, others claimed it was haunted by the spirits of those who had died within its walls. But for the new owners, the Sinclair family, the house was a dream come true, a chance to start over after a series of unfortunate events had left them searching for a new home. The Sinclairs arrived at Blackwood Manor on a crisp autumn afternoon. The house was even more imposing in person, its stone walls darkened by age and the creeping ivy that clung to its surface. The trees surrounding the property seemed to close in on the house, their twisted branches creating a canopy that blocked out the sun. As they pulled up the long, winding driveway, the family couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Despite its eerie appearance, the house itself was magnificent. It was a sprawling estate with tall, arched windows and intricate stonework. Inside, the rooms were grand but felt strangely cold, as though the warmth had long since departed. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and something metallic and sour, like the smell of old blood. As they began to settle in, strange things started happening. At first, it was small doors that wouldn't stay shut, lights flickering, and the feeling of a cold breeze passing through the house, even when all the windows were closed. But soon the disturbances became more pronounced. Footsteps echoed through the halls at night, and whispers could be heard coming from the darkened corners of the house. The youngest Sinclair, Emily, claimed she had seen a shadowy figure watching her from the end of her bed, but her parents dismissed it as a bad dream. However, the sense of unease grew with each passing day. The house felt alive, as though it was breathing, its walls pulsing with some unseen energy. And then there was the mirror in the master bedroom. It was an antique, the glass slightly warped with age, but when Sarah Sinclair looked into it, she could have sworn she saw something moving behind her, a dark shape, standing just outside the reflection's frame. But when she turned around, the room was empty. The family tried to carry on as normal, but the house had a way of getting under their skin. Arguments broke out over the smallest things, and the tension in the air became almost unbearable. The house, it seemed, was feeding off their fear, growing stronger with each passing day. And then, on the 7th night after their arrival, Emily disappeared. Part 2. The Search. Panic set in as soon as the Sinclairs realized Emily was gone. They searched the house from top to bottom, calling her name, but there was no answer. The house was a maze of dark corridors and hidden rooms, and it seemed to swallow their voices, muting their calls as they echoed through the empty halls. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside seemed amplified, as though the house itself was mocking their desperation. Sarah was frantic, her mind racing with terrible possibilities. Had Emily wandered off into the forest? Had she fallen down the old well they had found in the garden? Or was it something worse, something to do with the presence she had sensed in the house, the shadow that seemed to move just out of sight? The local police were called, and they conducted a thorough search of the property and the surrounding woods. But as the hours passed, their hope began to wane. There were no signs of a struggle, no tracks leading away from the house, nothing to indicate where Emily had gone. It was as though she had vanished into thin air. The police tried to reassure the Sinclairs, suggesting that Emily might have run away or that she was hiding somewhere in the house. But Sarah knew her daughter Emily was a quiet, sensitive child, and she had been terrified of the house from the moment they arrived. She wouldn't have run off on her own, not in the middle of the night. The days that followed were a blur of anxiety and despair. The house seemed to close in on them, its walls pressing down as if it were alive, as if it were feeding off their fear. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and Sarah began to hear Emily's voice among them, faint and distant, as though she was calling out from somewhere deep within the house. But no matter how hard she searched, she couldn't find her. Then, on the third day after Emily's disappearance, they found the first clue: a small, hand-drawn picture tucked under the rug in Emily's room. It was a crude drawing of the family, standing in front of the house, with a dark figure looming behind them. The figure had no face, just a blank space where its features should have been. Sarah's blood ran cold when she saw it. Emily had drawn the figure before, always saying it was her friend who watched over her while she slept. But it wasn't a friend. Sarah knew that now. Whatever it was, it had taken her daughter. The police were baffled, but Sarah and her husband, Tom, knew they were dealing with something beyond the realm of the normal. They contacted a local historian, hoping to find out more about the house's past, and what they discovered only deepened their fear. Blackwood Manor had a dark history, one filled with death and madness. The original owner, a man named Elias Blackwood, had been a recluse, obsessed with the occult. He had conducted strange rituals in the house, claiming he could communicate with spirits. But his experiments had gone horribly wrong, and one night he disappeared without a trace. The house had changed hands many times over the years, each new owner suffering some tragedy or misfortune, until it was finally abandoned. The historian warned the Sinclairs that the house was cursed, that it was a gateway between worlds, a place where the dead could cross over into the realm of the living. And now, it seemed, something had come through that gateway and taken Emily. But Sarah refused to give up. She knew her daughter was still alive, trapped somewhere in the house, and she was determined to find her, even if it meant facing the darkness that dwelled within Blackwood Manor. Part 3. The Shadows of the Past. Desperation drove Sarah to delve deeper into the history of Blackwood Manor. She spent hours in the local library, poring over old newspapers, journals, and letters, trying to piece together the events that had led to the house's dark reputation. The more she learned, the more she realized how dangerous the house truly was. Elias Blackwood had been a man obsessed with the afterlife. He believed that death was not the end, but merely a transition to another plane of existence. He had spent years studying ancient texts and conducting rituals designed to open a doorway between the worlds of the living and the dead. But his obsession had come at a terrible cost. According to the accounts Sarah found, Blackwood had become increasingly unhinged as he delved deeper into the occult. He began to hear voices, whispers in the dark, that promised him power and knowledge in exchange for his soul. Driven by madness, he began sacrificing animals, then people, in an attempt to summon the spirits he believed would grant him immortality. But instead of summoning spirits, Blackwood had unleashed something far worse. The final entry in his journal, dated the night he disappeared, spoke of a presence in the house, an entity that had come through the doorway he had opened. He described it as a shadow with no form, a void that consumed everything it touched. The last words in the journal were a frantic scrawl: "It is here. God help me, it is here." Sarah knew now that the presence in the house was not a ghost, but something far more sinister. It was a being from another plane, a creature of pure darkness that fed on the souls of the living, and it had taken Emily. The more she learned, the more the house seemed to change. The walls felt closer, the air thicker, and the shadows darker. The whispers that had once been distant were now constant, and Sarah could no longer tell if they were in her head or if they were real. She began to see things out of the corner of her eye, figures that vanished when she turned to look, and faces in the mirrors that weren't her own. Tom was growing increasingly concerned for her sanity. He tried to convince her to leave the house, to let the police handle the search for Emily, but Sarah refused. She couldn't leave not until she had found her daughter. But Tom's patience was wearing thin, and the strain was taking its toll on their marriage. The house seemed to thrive on their discord, feeding on their fear and despair. One night, after another argument, Sarah found herself drawn to the basement, a place she had avoided since they moved in. The door to the basement had always been locked, the key missing, but now it was ajar, as though inviting her in. She hesitated at the top of the stairs, the darkness below seeming to pulse with malevolent energy. But she knew she had to go down there. She had to find out what lay beneath the house, what secrets the basement held. The stairs creaked under her weight as she descended, each step taking her deeper into the darkness. The air grew colder, the smell of decay overwhelming. As she reached the bottom, she saw that the basement was filled with old furniture, covered in dust and cobwebs. But there was something else there, too, something that didn't belong. In the center of the room was a circle of blackened earth, surrounded by strange symbols carved into the stone floor. The symbols seemed to writhe and twist as she looked at them, as though they were alive. And in the center of the circle was a small blood-stained altar, its surface slick with something dark and viscous. But it was what lay beyond the altar that made Sarah's blood run cold. A large, ornate mirror stood against the far wall, its surface cracked and tarnished. The mirror was ancient, its frame carved with the same symbols that surrounded the altar. But the reflection in the mirror was not her own. It was a dark, swirling void, filled with shadowy figures that seemed to reach out towards her. Sarah backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew now what had happened to Emily. The entity that Elias Blackwood had summoned was still here, trapped in the mirror, but it was hungry. It needed more souls to sustain itself, and it had taken Emily as its latest victim. But as she turned to leave, she heard a voice, Emily's voice, calling to her from within the mirror. "Mommy, help me," it said, the sound echoing through the basement. Sarah turned back, her eyes wide with terror. She could see Emily now, her face pale and ghostly, trapped within the swirling darkness of the mirror. Sarah knew she had to save her daughter, but she didn't know how. The mirror was a gateway, a doorway between worlds, but it was also a prison, and she had no idea how to break the entity's hold on Emily without condemning herself in the process. But she knew one thing: she couldn't leave Emily there, no matter the cost. Part 4. The Descent. Sarah became consumed with the idea of rescuing Emily from the entity within the mirror. She spent every waking moment researching ways to break the curse that bound the creature to Blackwood Manor. She pored over ancient texts, consulted with occult experts, and even reached out to the historian who had first told them about the house's dark past. But the more she searched, the more elusive the answers seemed. Tom, meanwhile, grew increasingly distant. He could see the toll that the search for Emily was taking on Sarah, and he feared that the house was driving her mad. He tried to convince her to leave, to let the police and the experts handle the situation, but Sarah refused. She couldn't abandon her daughter, not when she was so close to finding a way to save her. The house seemed to feed on their discord, amplifying every argument, every moment of doubt. The whispers in the dark grew louder, more insistent, and the shadows that had once lurked at the edges of Sarah's vision now seemed to follow her wherever she went. She could feel the entity's presence growing stronger, its hunger more intense. It wanted more than just Emily, it wanted them all. One night, Sarah was awoken by the sound of Emily's voice calling to her from the basement. She rushed downstairs, her heart pounding, but when she reached the basement, she found the door locked. She could hear Emily's cries on the other side, growing more frantic with each passing moment. Desperate, Sarah pounded on the door, but it wouldn't budge. In her panic, she remembered the old journal she had found in the attic, a journal written by Elias Blackwood himself. She had been too afraid to read it at first, fearing what she might find, but now she knew she had no choice. If she was going to save Emily, She needed to understand what Blackwood had done. The journal was filled with ramblings, the thoughts of a man slowly losing his mind. But buried within the madness were details of the rituals he had performed and the steps he had taken to summon the entity that now haunted the house. Blackwood had been meticulous in his preparations, using ancient symbols and incantations to open the doorway between worlds. But there was one thing he hadn't anticipated: the entity's hunger. As Sarah read, she realized that Blackwood had tried to reverse the ritual, to banish the entity back to its own realm. But it was too late. The creature had grown too powerful, feeding off the souls of those it had consumed. Blackwood had been trapped in the house, just like Emily, and he had been driven mad by the knowledge that he had unleashed a force beyond his control. But there was something else in the journal, something that gave Sarah hope. Blackwood had discovered a way to weaken the entity, to trap it within the mirror. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it had given him time to plan his next move. The key to the ritual was blood, specifically, the blood of a sacrifice. Sarah recoiled at the thought, but she knew that she had no other choice. If she was going to save Emily, she would have to perform the ritual herself. She would have to spill blood. But whose blood? As she pondered this terrible question, she heard Emily's voice again, this time coming from the mirror in the living room. Sarah rushed to the mirror, her heart in her throat, but the reflection was empty. She could still hear Emily, but she couldn't see her. The entity was toying with her, drawing her deeper into its web. But Sarah was determined not to let it win. She would find a way to save her daughter, no matter the cost. Part 5. The Ritual. Sarah knew she had to act quickly. The entity was growing stronger, and Emily's cries were becoming more desperate. She couldn't wait any longer. She had to perform the ritual that Elias Blackwood had outlined in his journal. But the thought of spilling blood, of making a sacrifice, filled her with dread. She couldn't bring herself to harm anyone, not even for Emily's sake. As she sat in the darkened living room, staring at the mirror that had become the entity's prison, she realized that there might be another way. The journal had spoken of using blood to weaken the entity, but it hadn't specified whose blood. Perhaps there was a way to trick the creature, to use her own blood as the sacrifice. With trembling hands, Sarah retrieved a knife from the kitchen. The blade gleamed in the dim light, and she hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. Could she really do this? Could she really do this? Could she spill her own blood to save her daughter? But as she heard Emily's voice again, faint and distant, all doubts vanished. She had to try. She couldn't let the entity win. Sarah made a shallow cut on her palm, the pain sharp but manageable. Blood welled up from the wound, and she let it drip onto the mirror's surface. The blood spread out in thin lines, like cracks forming in the glass. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the mirror began to pulse with a sickly green light, and the air around her grew cold. The entity's presence filled the room, pressing down on her like a physical force. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and the shadows seemed to close in, suffocating her. But Sarah held her ground, determined to see the ritual through. She began to recite the incantation she had memorized from the journal, her voice trembling but steady. The words were in a language she didn't understand, but they seemed to resonate with power, echoing through the room. As she spoke, the mirror's surface began to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. The green light intensified, and the whispers turned to screams of anger, of hunger, of desperation. The entity was fighting back, trying to break free from its prison. But Sarah didn't stop. She repeated the incantation over and over, her voice growing stronger with each repetition. Then, with a final deafening scream, the mirror shattered. Shards of glass exploded outward, and Sarah was thrown to the ground. The room was plunged into darkness, the only sound the ragged sound of her breathing. For a moment, she thought she had failed, that the entity had escaped. But as the dust settled, she realized that the air was different. The oppressive weight that had filled the house was gone, and the whispers had fallen silent. But Emily was still missing. Despair threatened to overwhelm her, but Sarah forced herself to stand. She had weakened the entity, but she hadn't destroyed it. There had to be more to the ritual, something Blackwood hadn't written down. But what? As she searched the room for answers, she noticed something strange. One of the shards of glass from the mirror was glowing faintly, pulsing with the same green light as before. She picked it up, her fingers tingling as she touched the cold surface. And then she heard Emily's voice, clearer than ever before. "Mommy, I'm here." The shard was a piece of the doorway, a fragment of the gateway between worlds. Sarah knew what she had to do. She had to go through the doorway herself. But there was no guarantee she would come back. Part 6. The Other Side. Sarah stood at the edge of the precipice, the glowing shard of glass clutched tightly in her hand. The house was silent, the oppressive atmosphere lifted, but the darkness that filled the void left by the shattered mirror was even more terrifying. She knew that the entity was still there, lurking just beyond the veil, waiting for her to make a move. But she couldn't back down now. She had come too far. She held the shard up to the light, watching as the green glow intensified, and then, with a deep breath, she pressed it against the surface of the broken mirror. The light flared, blinding her for a moment, and when she opened her eyes, the world around her had changed. She was no longer in the living room of Blackwood Manor. Instead, she found herself standing in a vast, dark expanse. The air was thick and heavy, filled with an unnatural stillness. The ground beneath her feet was cold and smooth, like polished stone, and the only source of light came from the shard in her hand, casting an eerie green glow that barely penetrated the surrounding darkness. As her eyes adjusted, Sarah began to make out shapes in the distance, tall, shadowy figures that seemed to waver and shift as she approached. They were like silhouettes, featureless and indistinct, but she could feel their eyes on her, watching her every move. The whispers had returned, louder and more insistent than ever, but now they seemed to come from all directions, surrounding her, pressing in on her from every side. "Emily," she called out, her voice echoing through the void. "Emily, where are you?" For a moment, there was only silence. Then, faint and distant, she heard her daughter's voice. "Mommy, I'm here. Help me." The sound was faint, as though coming from far away, but it was unmistakably Emily. Sarah's heart surged with hope, and she began to move toward the source of the voice, her steps quickening as the sense of urgency grew. The landscape around her shifted and changed as she walked. The ground seemed to undulate beneath her feet, and the shadows grew darker, more oppressive. The figures she had seen earlier began to close in, their forms becoming more distinct as they moved closer. They were tall, gaunt, with long, spindly limbs and hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. They moved silently, their movements jerky and unnatural, like puppets controlled by invisible strings. Sarah kept moving, refusing to let the creatures deter her. She could hear Emily more clearly now, her voice growing stronger with each step. But the closer she got, the more the shadows seemed to close in, pressing down on her, making it harder to breathe. Finally, she saw a small figure huddled on the ground, surrounded by the shadowy creatures. It was Emily, her face pale and terrified, her eyes wide with fear. She was trapped, encircled by the dark figures, their long, bony fingers reaching out toward her. "Mommy," Emily cried, her voice trembling with fear. "Please help me." Without thinking, Sarah rushed forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She pushed her way through the circle of shadows, feeling their cold, clammy hands brush against her skin as she reached for her daughter. But as soon as she touched Emily, The shadows closed in around them, their hands clawing and grasping at her, pulling her away. The darkness became overwhelming, suffocating, and Sarah felt herself being dragged down into the void, the cold, icy grip of the shadows tightening around her throat. She fought back with all her strength, refusing to let go of Emily, but the darkness was too strong. It pulled them both down, deeper and deeper into the void, until there was nothing left but the cold, all-consuming blackness. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Sarah found herself lying on the ground, gasping for breath, her body trembling with fear and exhaustion. The darkness was still there, pressing down on her from all sides, but the shadows were gone. The only sound was the ragged sound of her breathing, echoing through the void. She looked around, searching for Emily, but her daughter was nowhere to be seen. Panic surged through her, and she called out her name, her voice trembling with desperation. "Emily, where are you?" For a long, agonizing moment, there was no response. Then, faint and distant, she heard Emily's voice again. "Mommy, I'm here. I'm scared." The sound was coming from below her, as though Emily was trapped somewhere beneath the ground. Sarah scrambled to her feet, the shard of glass still clutched in her hand, and began to dig, tearing at the cold, smooth surface of the ground with her bare hands. The ground gave way easily, crumbling beneath her touch, revealing a dark, yawning chasm below. And there, at the bottom of the pit, she saw Emily, her small form curled up in the darkness, her face pale and terrified. "Emily," Sarah cried, reaching down into the pit. "Take my hand." But Emily didn't move. She just stared up at Sarah with wide, frightened eyes, her body trembling with fear. "Mommy, I'm scared." Sarah's heart ached with a mixture of fear and determination. She couldn't leave her daughter down there, trapped in the darkness. She had to find a way to bring her back, to save her from the entity that had taken her. But as she reached out toward Emily, she felt a cold, clammy hand wrap around her wrist, pulling her back. She looked up, her heart pounding in her chest, and saw one of the shadowy figures standing behind her, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The creature pulled her away from the edge of the pit, dragging her back into the void. Sarah struggled, fighting with all her strength, but the creature was too strong. It pulled her down into the darkness, its cold, icy grip tightening around her throat, cutting off her breath. And as the darkness closed in around her, Sarah realized the terrible truth. She had never truly left Blackwood Manor. The entity had trapped her in its world, a twisted mirror image of reality, where the boundaries between life and death were blurred, and where the darkness was all-consuming. And now it had claimed her too. Part 7. The Haunting of Blackwood Manor. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, but the Sinclairs were never seen again. The house, once filled with the echoes of their lives, stood silent and empty, its windows dark and uninviting. The townspeople whispered about the family that had disappeared, about the strange occurrences that had plagued the manor, but no one dared to go near the house. It was cursed, they said, haunted by the spirits of the dead and by something far more sinister. The police conducted a thorough investigation, but they found no trace of the Sinclairs. It was as though they had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only their belongings and the faint, lingering scent of decay that filled the air. But those who were brave enough to venture near the manor reported strange occurrences, lights flickering in the windows at night, strange noises coming from within the walls, and the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. Some claimed to have seen figures moving in the shadows, tall, gaunt forms with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. The house had become a place of fear, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead was thin, and where the darkness held sway. The entity that had trapped the Sinclairs within its world was still there, waiting for its next victims, feeding off the fear and despair that permeated the air. And then, one day, a new family arrived at Blackwood Manor. They were a young couple, eager to start a new life in the countryside. They had heard the rumors, of course, but they dismissed them as mere superstition. The house was old, they said, and old houses had a way of accumulating stories. But they weren't afraid. They were excited to make the house their own, to fill it with new memories, and to leave the past behind. But the house had other plans. From the moment they stepped through the front door, they could feel the weight of the house pressing down on them, the air thick with a sense of unease. The rooms were cold and dark, the furniture covered in dust, and the smell of decay lingered in the air. But they tried to ignore it, to push through the discomfort, and make the house a home. But the house wouldn't let them. Strange things began to happen almost immediately. Doors that were closed would creak open on their own, and footsteps would echo through the halls at night, even though the house was empty. The couple would wake up to find objects moved from their original places, or to see shadows flitting across the walls, just out of the corner of their eyes. And then there were the whispers. At first they were faint, barely audible, but as the days went on, they grew louder, more insistent. They came from the dark corners of the house, from the shadows that lurked just beyond the reach of the light. The couple could never quite make out what they were saying, but they felt a growing sense of dread, as though the house itself was trying to communicate with them. The wife began to have nightmares, vivid and terrifying dreams in which she was trapped in a dark, endless void, surrounded by shadowy figures with hollow eyes. She would wake up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding in her chest, but the feeling of dread would linger long after she had awoken. The husband, too, began to feel the weight of the house pressing down on him. He would hear strange noises coming from the walls, scratching, tapping, as though something was trying to get out. He started to see faces in the mirrors that weren't his own, figures standing at the end of the hallway, just out of the corner of his eye. But the worst was yet to come. One night, the wife woke up to find herself alone in bed. The house was silent, the air heavy with a sense of foreboding. She called out for her husband, but there was no response. Panic surged through her, and she got out of bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She searched the house, calling out his name, but he was nowhere to be found. The house seemed to stretch on forever, the rooms twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. The shadows grew longer, darker, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. And then, in the living room, she saw the mirror. It was old, cracked, its surface tarnished and dark. But as she approached, she saw something moving within the glass. At first, she thought it was her own reflection, distorted by the broken glass, but then she realized with a jolt of terror that it wasn't. It was her husband. He was trapped within the mirror, his face pale and terrified, his eyes wide with fear. He was pounding on the glass, his mouth moving as though he was screaming, but no sound came out. The darkness swirled around him, the shadowy figures closing in, their hollow eyes glowing with malevolent intent. The wife screamed, a sound of pure terror, and she reached out to touch the mirror, but as soon as her fingers brushed the glass, the mirror shattered, and the room was plunged into darkness. The house had claimed its next victims. Part 8. The cycle continues. The story of Blackwood Manor spread far and wide, growing with each retelling until it became the stuff of local legend. The manor was a place of darkness, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead was thin, and where the shadows held sway. People spoke of the cursed house in hushed tones, warning others to stay away. But the allure of the unknown was too strong. Over the years, more families moved into the house, drawn by the cheap price and the promise of a fresh start. Some left after only a few days, driven out by the strange occurrences that plagued the manor. Others stayed longer, trying to make the house their home, but none were able to escape the darkness that lurked within its walls. The entity that had been summoned by Elias Blackwood centuries ago was still there, feeding off the fear and despair of those who entered the house. It was patient, biding its time, waiting for the right moment to strike. It was a predator, and the people who moved into Blackwood Manor were its prey. But the entity wasn't alone. The souls of those it had claimed were still trapped within the house, their spirits bound to the darkness, unable to move on. They became part of the entity's world, twisted reflections of their former selves, forever trapped in the void between life and death. And so the cycle continued, each new family adding to the house's growing list of victims. The darkness spread, consuming all who entered, until the house became a place of pure evil, a place where the living and the dead were one and the same. But even as the legend of Blackwood Manor grew, there were those who refused to believe. They dismissed the stories as mere superstition, the product of overactive imaginations and fear of the unknown. They said the house was just that, a house, nothing more. But those who had lived in Blackwood Manor knew the truth. They knew that the house was alive, that it was a place of darkness, a place where the shadows held sway, and where the dead never truly rested. And they knew that as long as the house stood, the cycle would continue. Part 9. The final stand. The decades passed and Blackwood Manor remained untouched, its reputation growing darker with each passing year. The once grand estate now stood as a dilapidated husk, its walls crumbling and its windows shattered, but the darkness within its walls remained as potent as ever. The townspeople had long since abandoned any hope of restoring the manor. It was a place best left to rot, a blight on the landscape that none dared approach. But there was one who refused to let the house's evil go unchallenged. Nathaniel Carter, a local historian and the grandson of the first historian who had uncovered Blackwood Manor's dark past, had spent his life researching the house's history, determined to put an end to the cycle of terror that had plagued Anarch's centuries. He had read Elias Blackwood's journal, studied the ancient rituals, and learned of the entity that had been summoned so long ago. He believed he had found a way to destroy the creature once and for all, to cleanse the house of its evil. But it would require a great sacrifice. Nathaniel had seen firsthand the devastation that Blackwood Manor had wrought on those who dared to enter its halls. He had lost friends, family members, and colleagues to the house's darkness, and he knew that if he failed, he too would be claimed by the entity. But he was willing to take that risk. He couldn't let the house's evil continue to spread, to consume more innocent lives. He gathered his supplies, a collection of ancient texts, a ceremonial dagger, and a vial of his own blood, which he knew would be needed to complete the ritual. He had studied Elias Blackwood's notes carefully, piecing together the details of the summoning ritual, and he believed he had found a way to reverse it, to banish the entity back to the realm from which it had come. On the night of the ritual, Nathaniel entered Blackwood Manor alone. The house was silent, its walls cold and unwelcoming, but he could feel the entity's presence lurking in the shadows, watching his every move. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the floor creaked beneath his feet as he made his way to the living room, where the shattered remains of the mirror still lay. He set up his supplies in the center of the room, careful to avoid the shards of glass that littered the floor. The house seemed to come alive as he began the ritual, the walls groaning and the shadows growing darker, more oppressive. The entity knew what he was trying to do, and it wasn't going to let him succeed without a fight. But Nathaniel was determined. He recited the incantation, his voice steady and strong, even as the air grew colder and the shadows pressed in around him. The words flowed from his lips, filled with ancient power, and the room began to tremble as the ritual took hold. The shadows writhed and twisted, forming into the same gaunt, hollow-eyed figures that had haunted the manor for centuries. They reached out toward Nathaniel, their hands clawing at the air, but he ignored them, focusing all his attention on the ritual. The dagger in his hand glowed with a faint, ethereal light, and he could feel the power of the incantation building within him, filling the room with a palpable energy. But the entity wasn't going to let him win so easily. With a deafening roar, the darkness surged forward, engulfing Nathaniel in a wave of cold, suffocating blackness. The shadows tore at his flesh, ripping into his mind, trying to break his will, but Nathaniel held on, refusing to let go of the dagger, refusing to let the entity win. He plunged the dagger into the center of the shattered mirror, the glass shattering into 1,000 pieces. The darkness screamed in pain, a sound that echoed through the house, shaking the very foundations of the manor. The shadows recoiled, pulling back from Nathaniel as the light from the dagger spread, burning away the darkness, pushing it back into the void from which it had come. But Nathaniel knew the ritual wasn't complete. The entity was wounded, but it wasn't destroyed. It was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its chance to strike. With a final, desperate effort, Nathaniel took the vial of his own blood and poured it over the dagger, the liquid hissing as it made contact with the blade. The light intensified, blinding him, and the darkness let out a final, ear-splitting scream before it was sucked back into the void, the mirror ceiling shut behind it. The room fell silent. Nathaniel collapsed to the floor, his body trembling with exhaustion. The house was still, the oppressive weight of the darkness lifted, but he knew it wasn't over. The entity was gone, banished back to the realm from which it had come, but the cost had been great. The house had taken a piece of him, a piece of his soul, and he knew he would never be the same again. But he had done it. He had broken the cycle. Blackwood Manor was finally free. Part 10. The Aftermath. The news of Nathaniel Carter's actions spread quickly through the town, and for the first time in decades there was hope. Blackwood Manor, once a place of terror and death, had been cleansed of its evil. The house was still standing, its walls cracked and its windows broken, but the darkness that had plagued it for centuries was gone. The townspeople began to talk about restoring the manor, turning it into a museum, a place where people could learn about the history of the town and the dark events that had taken place within its walls. There were those who still feared the house, who believed that the entity might one day return, but for the most part, the town began to heal. Nathaniel, however, was not the same. The ritual had taken a toll on him, both physically and mentally. He was haunted by nightmares, visions of the entity that had nearly claimed him, and he often found himself staring into the distance, lost in thought. The house had taken a piece of his soul, and he knew that he would never be able to escape its grasp completely. But he had done what he had set out to do. He had broken the cycle, freed the souls that had been trapped within the house, and banished the entity back to the void from which it had come. It was a victory, but it was a hollow one, and Nathaniel couldn't help but wonder if the cost had been too great. As the years passed, the town moved on, and Blackwood Manor became a place of curiosity rather than fear. Tourists would come to visit to hear the stories of the house's dark past and to see the place where the entity had been banished. But for those who had lived through the terror, who had lost loved ones to the house's evil, the scars remained. Nathaniel continued his work as a historian, but he never returned to Blackwood Manor. The memories were too painful, the cost too high. He devoted the rest of his life to studying the paranormal, to understanding the forces that had nearly destroyed him, but he never found the answers he was looking for. And as he lay on his deathbed, his body frail and weak, Nathaniel couldn't help but wonder if the entity was truly gone. It had been banished but not destroyed, and he knew that one day someone else might summon it, might bring it home. But for now, the house was silent, the shadows gone, the cycle broken, and that was enough. Or so he hoped.